Hello, podcast fam. I am thrilled to share some exciting news. My book, So Grow Lead, is officially live on Amazon. This book is more than just my story of starting a nonprofit and building a peanut butter factory in Malawi. So trust me, the ups and downs of that journey are worth the read. It's also packed with practical strategies to help nonprofit leaders like you tackle challenges with clarity, courage, and a whole lot of heart. If you've ever wondered how to turn your vision into reality, navigate the inevitable hurdles, and build something meaningful, whether in your organization or in your own life, this book is for you. I'd be so grateful for your support in spreading the word. Grab your copy of So Grow Lead in the show notes and on Amazon today. Let's keep sowing seeds of impact together. Are you a nonprofit professional who's feeling overwhelmed and burnt out? Well, welcome to the Lead with Heart podcast. I am your host, Haley Cooper. On this podcast, we will share stories of leadership, courage, and empathy that'll help you learn to take care of yourself, your staff, organization, and community. You will hear from nonprofit leaders who have been in your shoes and have learned best practices to raise more revenue and make a greater impact. Let's thrive together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Lead with Heart podcast. I'm excited to have Jane Pfeiffer, the founder and president of Fieldtrip, with us. Jane and her team recently conducted a survey of 400 participants from around the United States to explore people's thoughts and feelings about supporting nonprofits. So I am sure that this conversation is going to get juicy. And today in this podcast, she's going to share the fascinating insights from the survey and discuss how nonprofits can better connect with and engage their supporters. So welcome, Jane.
Well, thanks, Haley. I really appreciate having me on your show. And yeah, at Fieldtrip, we're really focused on helping nonprofit leaders reduce their largest expense. Oftentimes we think that's the cost of delivery or payroll or overhead, but it's really what we call an IDK. So I don't know if you've heard that term before, but that's short for I don't know. So I don't know you. I don't understand why your mission is important, and I don't understand how it impacts my world. So those create the cost of lost opportunities. And really, that's an organization's biggest expense because it limits their growth. So we're working with leaders that are frustrated because they're the best kept secret, or they're worried that what got them to today won't be the same tactics that can take them to tomorrow, or that their donors are fading faster than they can replace them. I don't know if that sounds like any of the issues that you find in your work, or does it?
Yeah, definitely. This idea of donor retention, or the I don't know you syndrome of nonprofits, is definitely something that I have experienced in my own work, and then work with nonprofits that I consult with now, is this idea of engaging supporters in their mission and taking time to share the impact of their gifts. And before we jump into the insights, I would love to know how you went from building marketing strategies for Ashley Home Store to now starting Fieldtrip, which helps nonprofit professionals.
Yeah, well, we might need a drink for that story, but yeah, my background was in media and research, and I had an Ashley Home Store client that over the years and finally wanted me to do their marketing. And so I thought I was starting a media buying agency. And what happened, that was 17 years ago, is I just kept adding to the team. And so our skill set shifted, and we sat down and took a look at the work we were doing and looked at, okay, who do we work best with? Where are we proudest of the work? Where can we make money? And where can we feel good about what we're accomplishing? And so it was unanimous that it was nonprofits. And so we just started a gradual shift towards this area of expertise. And it's interesting how often, though, that kind of retail strategy shows up not as a way to help nonprofits fundraise, but as a way to think about fundraising through a different lens and perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's so important to bring the different perspectives to marketing and fundraising in the nonprofit world from a business perspective, because some of it does apply across the board. So before we're going to get into the juicy details of the report, but what led you to conducting this report and any key findings about your survey on people's thoughts and feelings about supporting nonprofits?
Yeah, we had a belief that nonprofit fundraising has to change drastically. And we believe that there's really three parts to that. So, one is that the organization has to have a really unique position. They can't look and sound and feel like others in their sector. And they have to understand their audiences. And we kept running into donor audience descriptions that were demographic, based on average value, based on recency, legacy gifts versus recurring month, lapsed donors, all these criteria that, yes, you could put people into those classifications, but did it really make marketing and communications any easier? What would you tell someone in this age demographic versus this age demographic? And if it wasn't different, then where's the value of looking at your supporters through a lens of generation or age? And so we wanted to test that. And so what we did was this particular study, not knowing what we would find, but interviewing, as you said, 400 supporters. So these are people who describe themselves as being financial volunteer supporters of charitable organizations, specifically when the organization is helping the underserved, the less fortunate, and where there's usually a bigger empathy gap between the people that are receiving the benefits of the mission and then those that might never have had that type of life experience and yet have the resources to financially or time or skill set make the mission stronger. And so if that's where the biggest gap is, how do we look to bring and narrow that gap and close it where we can? And what came back was, well, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because a lot of missions that I've worked with or that I've spoken to really want to bring in that next generation of wealth. They see the older generation starting to have those planned and legacy gifts, but they also want to bring in that new generation. But there is a different mindset around giving. Before we talk about the solutions, can you talk about some of the challenges that you found nonprofits have faced in engaging multi-generations of giving?
Yeah, specific to just the multi-generations, it's also the tactics. So that could be the communication tools, but it could also be the events and event structures. Certain age groups will feel like the red tie or black tie gala could be repurposed differently and shouldn't be a show and tell event, should be converted into something else. Just like we know and study the audiences of the people who are in need, we also have to study the attitudes of the people that we want to support us. And what we found is when you group people by their attitudinal beliefs, then messaging and communications, it is possible to vary what you're saying by these categories, as opposed to, like I said, age, gender, zip code, or size of gift. We tend to make assumptions when we get into those types of characteristics. So what I find most often, back to your original question, Haley, is not thinking about attitudes, feelings, and beliefs when we're making requests or sharing why this work is so important.
So does that mean attitudes, beliefs about ourselves and like how we think? I've worked in boards where we're going to write a direct mail appeal and our boards, that won't work because of their belief of how a donor should give. When really, in reality, the donor behavior doesn't reflect that one individual. So is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's a perfect example. I would probably slice it a little bit in a different direction in that we're the best kept secret, and nonprofits will believe that if people are aware, they will care. Because I'm in the organization, this is my passion, I've signed up to do this, and I'm surrounded by people who feel similarly, even on the board. And so we buy into this false belief that if we could just make more people aware of us, they'll come. And that just isn't true. It depends on the attitude of the person. If they're highly empathetic, that might be enough. But if they're the other two categories, that won't matter until we work through a few obstacles. So that's, I guess, when I say beliefs around the beneficiaries of the mission, beliefs in their own relationship with giving and social barriers, those types of beliefs as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thank you for framing it that way. So based on your survey results, what are some of the primary motivations that drive individuals to support nonprofits? And were there any surprising factors that emerged from the data?
Yes, the biggest surprise was that we found 3 attitudes. That's not the biggest surprise, but what was revealed is that demographically, they're very similar. Statistically, there isn't enough difference to say, okay, this group is more female, this group is older, this group tends to be married. That's just simply not true. The demographic averages were very similar across all 3 groups. And to me, that was a big surprise.
Yeah. So what were those 3 attitudes that you found nonprofit supporters tend to give?
Well, Haley, when we went into this survey, it's really important to go with an open mind. So we didn't enter the survey thinking, okay, let's find 3 types. It could have been 5. It could have been, okay, attitudes aren't the defining line. But we found the characteristics that define these 3 groups are around their motivation to give, their why, their belief in a solution or that progress is possible, and then their views of the beneficiaries. So keep in mind, beneficiaries receiving the missions, and we're talking about human health social services. So we're not talking about humane societies and a cure for cancer. We're talking about the unhoused, food insecurity, racial and social injustices. And so those 3 things, the motivation, the belief in a solution, and the views are what define and separate these 3 attitudes.
Yeah, and I think that resonates. And I think a lot of times nonprofits struggle with helping donors or potential supporters to see that solution. We hark on the problem, and there's in Orange County like 20,000 kids experiencing homelessness, and we focus on the dire need of that problem rather than, and we could talk about the problem all day without positioning ourselves to be that expert in providing that solution. So how do you anticipate nonprofits utilizing this information to better engage their supporters to see themselves as a part of that solution?
Yeah, that's a really big question and a good one. So let me start with the end in mind. So what we have found is that the way we approach that ask, so often we don't tell the full story. And the full story matters because different attitudes will opt in at different points in that story. And I'll give an example of that. But for the continual story, we know that the human narrative is essential to what we do. And the first attitude group, our empathetic supporters, will understand that and get behind that. And like I said, they might opt in. But when we don't talk about, okay, what happens if we can now house 28,000 children? What happens in their life? What happens in their family's life? What happens in their neighborhood's life? And then what happens in our world, not only today, but in the future? And that's where the other 2 groups will tend to opt into a story. The attitudes aren't really linear at all. They're just different ways of thinking. So if it makes sense, I'll give you a highlight of the 3 attitudes. Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Okay. So the first one is the empathetic supporter. Keep in mind, these people have already opted in supporters. It's about 1/3 of the population classifies themselves as a nonprofit supporter. So with the empathy group, they're 33% of the supporter segment. They feel personally responsible for making a difference in the world. And their family has always helped people and values doing that type of work and investment. They believe that any solution, even the most complex social solutions, can be improved or solved if enough people focus on it. And they understand that the beneficiaries, the recipients of programs and services worthy of help, and it could happen to any of us at any time. And we just shouldn't judge. Therefore, give freely, hold back your assumptions and prejudices, and really give everybody the chance that they so deserve. So that's our empathetic group. When we get to the next group, which is 34% of the segment, they're skeptical supporters. So they're still supporters, they're donating, volunteering, but they support nonprofits primarily because their friends and family admire them for doing so. Not universally, but these people are more likely to show up where there is social recognition, name recognition, or a personal connection. If you wear a branded shirt, well, do you like it because it says, hey, I'm wearing this brand, or for some other reason? And there is a bit of pity. I know that's a 4-letter word for a reason, that they feel guilty that they haven't helped. Now, when it comes to believing in a solution, they think that needing help from a nonprofit is usually the result of bad choices. So they don't understand the complexity, and we have to help them understand that it's just because so-and-so didn't go to work today or didn't get a job. It's not that simple. And that's where we have to help them break through that. And then they believe that beneficiaries are fundamentally very different from them. They brought their challenges on themselves, and there's a limit to how much support they should receive. We may not agree with this, but we do need to recognize that a third of our supporters do think that way. And then the last group, 34% as well, is our disconnected supporters. And they're disconnected for a couple reasons. So when it comes to their motivation, they do think it's important work and continual progress needs to be made. And that no matter your background or experiences, everyone is possible or capable of making change. In their belief in a solution, they're a little more disconnected in they don't know that it's possible. So we have to show continual progress. And then when they think about the beneficiaries, they feel that everyone is responsible for their own choices and that some people will never get out of a bad situation, no matter how much we help them. Those are hard words to say. It's not that we are going to convince the disconnected to become empathetic, because they said loud and clear in the survey that you can't make me feel empathy. You either have it or you don't. And so that's the wrong lever. We have to connect the dots between our human story and how it might impact their world. Haley, I'm interested, just since you're hearing this for the first time, what are your thoughts and comments? Where does your mind go when you're hearing about these different attitudes?
Yeah, it's something that I haven't really thought about in that framework or in that perspective, but it does make sense. There are those empathetic ones who are all in and they want to change the world. And there's those skeptical ones who they give for that recognition, maybe that donor name on the wall or that plaque or the building named after them. But again, they're disconnected from the reality of the situation and don't really understand. And I think when you talk about the skeptical, I was talking on a podcast last week about the role of the nonprofit to educate people on the need, right? Because when you think about 28,000 kids experiencing homelessness in Orange County, people automatically think of homelessness as people living on the street with mental health and substance abuse issues, right? Family homelessness looks a lot different. And so it's an important role as a nonprofit to educate people on what the actual cause is. And then, yes, I do think there are those disconnected donors that give, but they don't really want to be involved in the mission. And as a fundraiser, that's hard, right? Because you feel like you have to engage them. But I've had donors who are like, I'll write a check every year or a few checks a year, but don't send me a letter, right? They're like, we want to give out of a place of generosity, but we don't really want to be involved in the mission. So I think I can relate to that. And how have you now taken this data to inform your nonprofit clients to engage donors in each of these segments? So we can start with the empathetic donor. How can nonprofits engage those type of donors in a meaningful way?
Yeah, the answer is storytelling, but it's storytelling with what we call the ripple effect. So let's take Marlista, a working mom, 2 young kids, hectic morning, and something's wrong with her car. She can't get to work. She can't get the kids to school because bus transportation is a huge issue in public education these days. Won't go there, but it's more than just an inconvenience because she doesn't have the money to fix that engine. Well, then she has to give up her job. If she has to do that, well, then now she's leaning on social services. And are her kids in school or out or intermittent? And what's happening to their learning opportunities? And so if we fix that problem, if we're not a nonprofit that says, hey, we fix automobile engines for those in need, okay, well, that's what we do. And for the empathetic supporter, that might be enough. I can imagine what that would feel like and not to have a neighbor, family, or friends to call on and say, hey, can I borrow your extra car? Can you loan me the $700 I need to fix this car? Public transit isn't an option. I can imagine what that feels like. But for the skeptical supporter, what they have to understand is the changes, the impact that has by no longer having reliable transportation and how that is very a complex, it's not an easy thing to fix, even though it might sound easy. And so we have to give the skeptical supporter an understanding of the complexity around what happened that the person is in need and why they can't just do one thing or make one decision and it's all better. And then for the disconnected supporter, we have to prove that, yes, we put in $700 into Marlista's engine. She's back at work, which now she's earning an income. She's paying local taxes. Her kids are in school. Her employer doesn't have to recruit and train a new employee. And then show that this is a sustainable model and that it's also scalable. So not only can we do it once, but we do it thousands of times. And so when we take care of a $700 problem, that impacts thousands of dollars of economic impact. And that's where the disconnected supporter will start to listen because now they see, well, it does impact my world. If we didn't have to spend X in this area of social services, where could that go? What could happen? And I want to make sure that we are not advocating to forget the human story or to minimalize it with data and numbers. We're just saying take that story and add the last mile so that everybody can hear and pay attention to the portion of the story that resonates with them the most.
Imagine a fundraising partner that not only helps you raise more money, but also supports you in retaining your donors. A partner that helps you raise funds both online and on location so you can grow your impact faster. That's DonorBox, a comprehensive suite of tools, services, and resources that give fundraisers just like you a custom solution to tackle your unique challenges, helping you achieve the growth and sustainability your organization needs, helping you help others. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. Yeah, I think that's so important. I'm a former grant writer, so I understand the importance of data in communicating stories. And it is that you have to find that balance and that blend of tugging on the heartstrings while also tapping into that rational, logical side that some people do.
Mm-hmm.
To see those numbers, to see that ROI, for lack of a better term, in a scalable way, right? But we also do have to bring it back to that human piece and us being able to see ourselves in that situation.
That's the formula, and changing the language so that we're not only simply asking for support, but we're seeking an investment in a solution and stealing a page from the startup world and how we look at this as really social entrepreneur. Here, we're preventing problems by helping this person with job training, by helping this person with transportation.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And there's been conversations in a Slack channel that I'm a part of where people are asking, are we moving like the effective communication methods and effective methods to reach the donors? And some are like, well, we need to remove checks so that we can do more digital, or we need to do like stock and other assets. Like there's so many ways to communicate with our donors about how they can give to our organization. So how can nonprofits, from your findings, improve their communication strategies? And did the survey reveal any preferred methods or channels to resonate with the audience?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, the top methods are really outside our control. So the most influential events are current events that tell, that story for us, aren't directly from us. A recent experience with the issue, so either the person themselves, coworker, family, friend has some type of need. A movie or documentary is also. So those top three are the most compelling across all three groups, but outside of our control. The next most effective tactics are, again, that human story, actually meeting a beneficiary, attending a fundraising or social event, participating in an event. And then the least successful was being prompted in a transaction, the roundup scenarios of the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think there are a lot of influencers or movies that have been produced on certain topics. And how can nonprofits leverage that, like you were saying, whether it's a news article or some sort of media piece or a movie, like how can even like small nonprofits, those ones who are like, we're the best kept secret, because sometimes these media are about certain nonprofits, but it is about a topic overall. Like how can nonprofits leverage that to build awareness and communicate with potential donors?
Yeah, so you have to get ahead of that and position yourself as a thought leader in that sector. So if it's food insecurity and you are developing, whether it's presentations or blogs, but continually talking about this topic and the impact of the topic, what's changing, how it impacts the community, and doing that in spaces and places so that you're the first person they call when an unfortunately tragic news event, well, and it has to do with food insecurity. Well, we know that Haley is an expert on this. Let's get her opinion. And so you're being sought as a resource in that news story or press opportunity. And so where can you show up in community organizations, business organizations, and be talking about this investment strategy in solving this issue, and that it takes all of us coming together to do so, showing up in a way that doesn't feel like the traditional appeal for donations. It has to be different.
Yeah, and I like that idea of investment strategies. Like I always talk about how it's an investment into a nonprofit. You're inviting people to invest in the mission, to be a part of it, to make that actual sustainable change. And I think that's so important to communicate it that way and really build that thought leadership for the nonprofit organization. So, from the insights in your data, what are some best practices for nonprofits to build and maintain those long-term supporters?
The first step would be retraining your mind to think first about the attitudes and what people want to hear or would be open to learning about, not necessarily what we want to tell them. Because we believe so often that if people are aware, they will care, we tend to explain what we do and how we do it, and not really inspiring and inviting people to solve the problem along with us. So if we can pause before we write next month's email newsletter or this year's annual impact report and think about the beliefs and the misperceptions that lie in these attitudes. How do we leverage those or break them? What might that look like? And if we make an emotional connection first, then we have their attention and we might be able to tell that more tactical explanation. But we first have to provoke curiosity and thought. And that spark, I think we tend to skip over it.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. And are there any other insights that you would like people to know about this survey and the things that you found?
Yeah, wow. There's additional data on the characteristics of the nonprofit, what these supporters are looking for. I don't think it will be earth-shattering. However, with the skeptical supporter, they're more interested in what you do with their money. So rather than check out your impact reports and things like that before making a donation, they're more concerned on how you tell them their donation was put to work, made an impact. So there's a nugget there. But again, using attitudes as the lens, telling stories with multiple chapters, and then realizing that inspiration followed by education is really a winning formula.
Yeah, I love that. And if people want to learn more about the work that you do and this survey, where can they find you?
Our website is wearefieldtrip.com. And my email is janep@wearefieldtrip.com. And you can find the research, just wearefieldtrip.com/research, and you can get an executive study, visualization of the data, and more.
And we will make sure to link that on the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Jane, for being here and giving us insight into the report that you conducted and the valuable practical strategies that people can implement in their own nonprofits.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
If you have valued these stories or learned something from what you've heard, please share this podcast episode or follow me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for your support, and together we can build a better community and world.